Blizzard has shared our very first official look at player housing in World of Warcraft, as well as their philosophies and plans for the future, and it's not entirely what I expected. Some of it is, some of it's quite surprising, and while player housing is the single feature I've been most excited about for a long time, I have to admit some of it really worries me, like way more than I was expecting. So first things first, Blizzard's 3 pillars for housing are stated to be boundless self-expression, deeply social, and long-lasting journey. On the surface, none of this is surprising. Player housing is, at its core, a feature about self-expression, and always has been. Nobody buys houses in Skyrim because they're that desperate for the buff you get from sleeping in your own bed. No, people buy houses so that they can spend hours carefully trying to decorate it with all the fun little items they find on their travels, and get upset when all their beautiful decorations keep falling down for no apparent reason. MMOs are largely the same. Nobody buys a house in Elder Scrolls Online because of its utility. Okay, that's not true. The houses in ESO service portals, which does make them incredibly useful, bad example. But generally speaking, player housing has always been about creative self-expression. Houses are, essentially, a cosmetic feature, like transmog or mounts. I am interested in the description of boundless self-expression though. That's an ambitious promise, and if we look closer at this point, Blizzard very clearly seems to talk about wanting players to be able to build a house. Not just decorate, build. Our highest priority is to allow players to build a house that shows off their own personal tastes or their warbands, acts as a desired backdrop for role-playing, or just allow players to create something in a flight of fancy. The tool set should be easy enough for someone with no 3D experience to be comfortable with and use successfully, but it should also be powerful enough that players can surprise us with their creations or drill down to get the tiniest details just right. The gamut of decor options spans not just the cultures of Azeroth, but the many expansions of World of Warcraft as well. This is already quite a lot more than I was expecting. It does seem to promise that players will be able to design and build their own houses, which is an exciting prospect. While I don't think we can expect brick-by-brick design like building in something like Sons of the Forest, the toolset they're describing sounds far more powerful than, say, a player housing version of customizable mounts. Although, I have to admit, I still hope we get some pre-designed set houses as well, ones that are in cities rather than neighborhoods, but I'll talk more about that later. We did already know that the isolation element of garrisons was something that concerned Blizzard, so it's not a surprise to see them prioritize making sure player housing isn't asocial. Deeply social, however, is again quite an ambitious promise, and this one worries me. According to Blizzard, World of Warcraft is more fun with other players, and housing should be no different. While players can enjoy housing purely on their own, its systems are designed at a fundamental level to encourage interacting, playing, and progressing with friends, neighbors, guilds, and the wider community in a meaningful way. As I said, I worry about this one, quite a lot actually, and not just because the last time we heard the word meaningful a lot was when they were using meaningful choice to defend locking players to covenants. I mean, yes, I do agree that World of Warcraft can be a lot of fun with other players. It is an MMO, and housing, especially neighborhood housing, does have the potential to be a lot of fun to share, especially in a guild environment. All of this is true, but even with the claim that it can still be enjoyed alone, I'm just not sure I'm thrilled with the idea that housing has been fundamentally designed to encourage being social. Because when Blizzard tries to design content around behavior they want to encourage in players, they do have this tendency to have all the subtlety and restraint of a brick. So what will this encouragement look like? How reliant is this going to make you on other players? How forced is it going to feel? Because the other problem is, players don't tend to respond well to feeling forced into content they don't enjoy, even if they would enjoy the thing if they just gave it a chance. And that includes being social. I also can't shake the feeling that Blizzard is taking something they really want and trying to force it onto something players really want, with a crowbar if necessary, whether that naturally fits or not. And I do get it. World of Warcraft is gaining a reputation for not being social at all anymore. I've seen it described as being surrounded by ghosts. People are there, but nobody talks to you. Obviously, this isn't great for the game, while more social interaction would be, so I understand Blizzard's motivation here. I just don't think that necessarily makes it the right problem to expect player housing to solve. Like, are these social aspects genuinely something that will make player housing better, or are they just there because of an entirely unrelated agenda? Which is maybe an unnecessarily loaded word, but you know what I mean. Obviously, it's going to depend a lot on how this is done, and I have to be fair here. Despite my many misgivings, I also do believe it could wind up being great. A lot of social content in World of Warcraft is kinda high stress. Raiding, Mythic Plus, and PvP, for example, all put players in high-pressured environments where it's very easy to wind up getting yelled at by some kid online because you made a mistake. On the flip side, when players wind up getting together to help each other out with challenges like Johnny or the Fell Cycle mount, it's often very wholesome and fun. Content that's more easygoing but still really desirable can be really good for socializing. And yeah, maybe player housing could work for that. But even so, important enough to be one of the 3 fundamental pillars of design? I guess we'll have to see. We also already knew that Blizzard wants player housing to be a permanent long-term feature because they tell us that pretty much every chance they get. Housing is being built as an evergreen addition to the game with its own roadmap reaching across multiple patches and into future expansions. Housing isn't something players should expect to finish, but instead continually look forward to the next housing release, be it new content or systems. This is a long-term commitment for us as developers and offers players rewards all along the way. This one is pretty important because Blizzard has had a track record of introducing new ideas that they abandon at the end of an expansion or when players don't respond as well as they hoped. In fact, Blizzard has introduced and then largely abandoned player housing itself at least twice before, first with the Mists of Pandaria farm and then with garrisons. So sort of this time we really mean it is welcome. I also suspect this promise has a bit to do with managing expectations as well. As I said in my Everything We Know About Player Housing video from before we knew so much more about player housing, we can expect player housing to be diverse, eventually. But every single option all at once right at the start is probably a bit of a tall order. So when that self-expression isn't quite as boundless as people might hope when it's first introduced, it's really important, or at least Blizzard are really hoping, that we remember more is coming, always. It's a system that will keep growing. But yeah, I think it's fair to expect the very first taste of this new system to be a bit limited. The neighborhoods, for example. Well, let's get into the bit about zoning. So Blizzard have decided on 2 housing zones at launch, one for the Alliance and the other for the Horde. Generally this is something I expected, not the zones thing, but the 2 major options, one Alliance, one Horde, so I'm not exactly flawed here. But there has been some concern, and not just from me, because, well, we do all remember garrisons. Garrisons came in 2 aesthetics, Human Alliance and Orc Horde, and if you were a Blood Elf who didn't like spiked decor, well, you were out of luck. In a Dragonflight interview with Hazelnutty Games, before we knew player housing was happening, Ian Hazikastas was asked about it and specifically mentioned this as a problem. And he stated back then that player housing would have to have more options than that if it was going to exist in World of Warcraft.
Doing the garrisons back in Warlords, frankly, due to resource constraints, we were limited in kind of offering, this is the Alliance garrison, this is the Horde garrison. And people were like, well, I'm a Blood Elf. I want cool Silvermoon architecture in my garrison. Why can't I build that? And the answer was like, I mean, that was the original cost you a raid tier joke, but actually it was kind of true. It's like, well, this is how many thousands of hours it would take to make that. That's what player housing has to be, if and when we make it happen.
But now, well, the housing zones at least are Human Alliance and Orc Horde. The Alliance zone takes inspiration from Elwyn Forest with touches of Westfall and Duskwood, and the Hordes is inspired by Durotar, its coastline, and Ashara. So if you wanted the aesthetic of, say, Eversong Woods, well, tough. And Blizzard's reasoning for this isn't comforting. First, having many housing zones conflicts with the second pillar of designing a feature that is deeply social. In a world where players can live in many different zones, they become increasingly spread out, and even with aggressive sharding, the chance of seeing other players, much less interacting with them, drops quickly. Do you see why I worry about the social aspect being considered a fundamental pillar of housing? because already this feels like a decision being made that sacrifices something that could be better about housing for the sake of forcing the social agenda. And again, when I say social agenda, you know what I mean. But I am being mildly unfair because this isn't their only reason. The second one is, putting it bluntly, zones are a lot of work. We'd much rather do a great job with a small number of zones than do a passable job on a large number, or come up with solutions that take the player out of the world into their own personal instance of a zone. We chose these as our starting points because of how iconic they are for their respective factions and how much they feel like home to so many players already. And, you know, this is fair. It is also almost exactly what they said about garrisons and why they didn't have more options. And it was fair then as well, but that didn't stop it from being a problem. You can see why some players are a little less than thrilled about this one. And I do have to point out, it's not the same. And not just because Frostfire Ridge is covered in snow and not sand, so that's not actually like a Durotar zone. For a start, Alliance characters can hang out in the Horde zone, and vice versa, which is already an improvement over garrisons. And again, there's that promise of constant growth and boundless self-expression when it comes to building. Maybe players' views are limited, but even if buildings are limited to the two standard orc or human designs at first, other designs should follow. Like, we've got to have elf buildings by midnight, we can expect that. Still, the concept art of what a Horde neighborhood could be is, well, if you're that blood elf who resented the orc aesthetic during garrisons that Ian mentioned before, this isn't going to encourage you. But let's take a look at the concept art that accompanied the post. If you look closely at the houses in this Horde neighborhood, there's definitely a suggestion of having certain basic tools to work with that you can then arrange in different ways. I do also appreciate the attempts at some diversity in the setting. Waterfalls are really cool, so is the idea of beach houses. I like this darkened area. With some more housing options, the Forsaken could feel quite at home here. And it's nice to see some vegetation, both tropical trees and these more traditional forest kind. Honestly, a reminder that Ashara is quite a different look to Durotar, so this zone can be expected to have more diversity than all orange desert all the time. The Alliance zone concept art doesn't really show off the neighborhood, it's a much closer view. It does seem to showcase the build your own house options, with houses showing off a mixture of roof colors and room types, from towers to stables, and oh yes, there's a stable with a griffin mount clearly in view. I mean, we knew this one was happening. Player housing was always going to have a way to showcase your mounts. It's one of the only things they got right about garrisons, but it's still nice to see some confirmation. It is a little bit depressing that the concepts look so much like garrison concept art, and that the Horde neighborhood looks like a war camp while the Alliance look like actual homes, and that the orc house options just don't seem as diverse as the human ones. Though to be fair, that could just be because the human image is closer, showing the houses more, while the orc image is further away, showing more of the neighborhood itself. I'm also not necessarily saying I would have liked to see a human house in the Horde area and an orc house in the human area, because yeah, maybe that would look strange and out of place, but Blood Elf architecture would look just as strange next to all these orc houses as a human house would. So some diversity would have at least been a bit more comforting. I have to admit, Durotar is a bit of a sore point for me. I really don't like orange, and I don't like sand, and I've never liked Orgrimmar much. I think it's the most boring of the Horde cities. According to the lore, the orcs settled in the harsh desert partly as a form of penance for their past. So that kinda means the Horde's player housing zone canonically is a bit of a punishment, even for races like the Blood Elves, who are some of the victims for the atrocities the orcs are supposedly being punished for. I mean, obviously this is not the intention here, but it's kind of funny. And yes, I know that we're not locked to faction with player housing, and so Horde players can go live in the Alliance zone if they really want, but I don't particularly want that either. It's not the Alliance cities that I personally like more, it's the other Horde cities. The solution of being able to go live in the Alliance zone feels like it kind of misunderstands the problem. Stormwind is beautiful, but I'm not comfortable there. I want Eversong Woods, like just let me live in Eversong Woods. Durotar used to be a fertile land, and the Orc Heritage questline has kinda hinted that it will be again, one day. So personally, I'd like to at least see some of that in the Horde zone. and for Orgrimmar in general to be completely abandoned and replaced by literally any other major horde city, but I know that much at least is a bit too much to ask. The two other concept art images are of rugged decor and folk decor, which they're not fooling anyone here, it's orc and human. Again, we know for a fact decoration types won't stop there. The gamut of decor options spans not just the cultures of Azeroth, but the many expansions of World of Warcraft as well. So not only will we get Blood Elf decor, Draenei decor, etc., but expect things like ethereal decor and Venthyr decor at some point as well. And oh shush, Shadowlands had a lot of problems, but zone aesthetics was never one of them. I mean, apart from the maw, we don't talk about the maw. But even if player housing starts just with the orc and human, rustic and folk decor, these images are both so diverse all on their own, I'm not even complaining. Both show a variety of furnishings, beds, chairs, tables, shelves, as well as light fixtures and even pillars. Also, do you see the storage chests? Will we get actual storage options that aren't just our bags and banks? Please, dear God, let that be true. We can see a variety of different weapon and armor racks. I really hope we can swap out the weapons and armor in these sorts of items. I love the idea of just a weapon bucket. Also, being able to just place down armor, like these shields or the boots, is a great way to really get a ton of use out of our transmog libraries, and I really hope that's a thing. Rugs, paintings, wall hangings, cushions, and just a ton of decorative knickknacks are all expected. Also food and drink. The one place I wouldn't hate seeing some utility is some sort of extra buff if you actually eat and drink at your table. Maybe it lasts longer or something. It'd also be cool if you can send an ult to sleep and it increases the rate at which they restore their rested bonus. Like, nothing game breaking, just reason enough to engage with these things. It's also nice to see potted plants and flowers, which is something we can see in the human neighborhood concept art as well. I think it goes without saying that player housing does mean an interest in decorating the outside of our houses as well as the inside. Also, notice that's a cactus apple cactus from one of the first quests orc players get in their original starting areas. What do you want to bet that particular decorative item comes from a quest reward? One thing Blizzard makes clear in their blog post is that they want housing to be for everyone. And here's where they take a direct shot at Final Fantasy XIV, which is quite a cocky move considering the fact that Final Fantasy already had an established housing system long before World of Warcraft was trying and failing to get things like covenants to work. But there are problems with Final Fantasy housing, infamously so. So since World of Warcraft system seems to be trying to mostly copy the Final Fantasy model, it is nice to know that doesn't mean it will come with all of the same problems. If you want a house, you can have a house. No exorbitant requirements or high purchase costs, no lotteries, and no onerous upkeep. And if your subscription lapses, don't worry, your house doesn't get repossessed. Which is great, really important. Nobody wants to pay a ridiculous amount for a house, or lose it if their subscription lapses. All good stuff. Except, no, hear me out, I actually do kind of hope that at least some houses will come with a high cost. No, listen, maybe not the ones you build in a housing zone, but one of my favorite memories in Elder Scrolls Online was riding past Ebonheart Manor and immediately deciding that would be my goal in game. To save up enough and earn the required achievements to buy it. I like the idea of grand houses as aspirational content, in the same way that I love things like the Tavane and Johnny mounts. And isn't a house just so much more special than a mount? Though of course, you may have already spotted the problem. I am still kinda clinging on to the Elder Scrolls Online housing model, where houses are instanced areas that you can purchase and decorate. But this does not fit into Blizzard's social neighborhood vision. I guess certain decorations can and will still be aspirational, high-effort items to obtain. But the thing is, I actually want to collect houses. I don't just want the one in the one zone. Okay, two in the two zones. I want a small house in Dornogal and maybe one in Merelda. I want a house in Grizzly Hills. I mean, come on. Everyone wants a house in Grizzly Hills. I want my Pandaria farm to be added to the housing system so that I can decorate it properly. Not the garrisons, that's fine, you can leave that. But they've said they don't want to do instances. I think that's a mistake. And I think if they did want to introduce instanced houses later on as well, it would be a lot easier than starting with the instanced houses at first and then only introducing the build your own house in a neighborhood system later on. So I'm not going to give up hope. In other words, I'm going to keep being a pain about wanting this. Sorry. Quick spoiler warning for patch 11.1 for the next bit. Skip ahead if you don't want to know. In Undermine, players can get an apartment that you can't decorate yet as far as I know, but you can set your Hearthstone there and it is considered yours. It's kinda like the Pandaria farm. You earn it through a quest that's very similar to the sort of quest you earn your first simple player home through in Elder Scrolls Online. I want that apartment to be an area that you can place decorations in. And honestly, I thought that was the plan, that later on they were gonna go, surprise, first taste of player housing. And I know that was always a reach, but it's just a strange addition, especially now if they were never intending to have a player any role in housing at all. Unless they're just trying to say, look, isn't this terrible? The system we're actually going with is so much better, which would be a risk, and specifically cruel to me. But anyway, the whole not being able to lose your house thing is great. Again, except, because here's another thing that worries me, neighborhoods themselves. Because people aren't reliable. You can't actually have a neighborhood like in real life because, well, real life gets in the way. A lot of people who have played this game for any length of time know the feeling of a guild dying, of all the friends that you used to play with all the time, that you loved playing with, one day logging off and just never logging back on again. When I started playing World of Warcraft, I didn't want to. I thought it was ugly. It was my friends who got me into it. Not one of those friends still play today. So, here's my question. What happens to a neighborhood when all your neighbors decide they don't actually feel like playing anymore? Or when the guild you're in dies? I don't play Final Fantasy XIV, but I was told by someone, so if this is wrong, blame them, not me, that the repossession of the houses system is meant to try combat ghost town neighborhoods. So what happens when you take that away? I mean, I still think it's better not to repossess houses overlap subscriptions. I just wonder how that's going to affect neighborhoods. And what if your chosen neighborhood turns out to be filled with people who aren't as nice as you initially thought? Can you just move your house to a different neighborhood? What about the plots? Could you end up conflicting with other people about that one pretty spot above the waterfall that you all want? I mean, I'm not even going to get into neighborhoods where the one friend has the worst taste and so has built the ugliest possible house that just upsets you every time you see it. Or a potentially worse flip side, the invention of digital homeowners associations. Blizzard says there will be two types of neighborhoods. Public neighborhoods, which the game servers are responsible for creating as needed and maintaining, and private neighborhoods created by groups of friends or guilds to inhabit, progress, and customize together. I can only assume this means Blizzard will make some sort of effort to stop the public neighborhoods from becoming ghost towns, but the private neighborhoods are up to us. And that does seem fair, but it also sounds truly heartbreaking if you do lose your neighbors, even more than a guild dying. I do wonder if you can be in multiple neighborhoods, I mean beyond one house on the Alliance side and one on the Horde. The private neighborhoods aren't locked to guilds, which is great because if you're in a guild for raiding, they might not always be filled with people who are also interested in player housing. But what if you have a group of friends who want to design a neighborhood around a specific aesthetic, but you also would like to have a house in your guild's neighborhood, and both neighborhoods are in the Horde zone? Can you have a house in both, or will you have to choose? And then if you end up choosing a neighborhood that later turns into a ghost town, while the other neighborhood is thriving but also has no more space for you, isn't that just going to feel terrible? Will you even be able to move neighborhoods? I mean, with your whole house. On the other hand, if you can have a house in as many different neighborhoods as you want, isn't that going to run the risk of players stretching themselves too thin, abandoning certain neighborhoods? Also, what happens if you have to kick someone from your guild? Can you evict them from your neighborhood as well? Will there be some sort of neighborhood kick system? And if there is, could that end up being abused? This also makes me wonder about your house itself. Do you have to rebuild and redecorate every time? Can you copy a house that you've already designed into another neighborhood if you want to? Or even share designs with others, like Transmog? Can you share storage across houses, or do you have to try to remember which house you left your flasks in? And please don't just make a bank storage, Blizzard, are you listening? Make it separate to bank storage. Can you have more than one house in a single neighborhood? And what about having different house decoration setups for different characters? Sharing houses across your warband is great, but what if you want your mage to have a library, but your warrior wants to use that room as an armory? Do you keep building houses, endless plots across endless neighborhoods? And what about service drain? Isn't that why the same model in Final Fantasy is limited? Most of all, I'm very curious and not a little worried about this mention of being able to progress a neighborhood with other players. Private neighborhoods created by groups of friends or guilds to inhabit, progress, and customize together. Inhabit, sure, we move in. Customize, yeah, as everyone builds houses. But progress? What does that mean? Are we talking about some group effort, like contributing flame-blessed iron to unlock major excavations on Siren Isle? But unlock what? More plots? Better scenery? Access to house designs? Basically, what I'd like to know is how limited are you going to be if you're unable to progress your neighborhood? What is that going to look like? How much is this encouragement that we be social going to translate into being thoroughly punished if we're not? Or if we only have 5 friends we want to be in a neighborhood with, not 50? And look, I'm not saying I think the idea of everyone contributing to progress a neighborhood is inherently bad. I think group efforts can be a lot of fun. I mean, remember Stone Soup, where a member of your raid puts down a kettle and then everyone contributed food until you had a feast for the raid? My guild loved that. Now imagine something like Dragonflight's community feast playing a role here. Only as a neighborhood you all contribute to something in the lead up to, say, Love is in the Air. And then because you did that, your neighborhood is decorated for the festival. And okay, this is some wild speculation based on a single word, but still, imagine. But being the only person who's putting any effort in, or feeling limited because the people around you just don't care as much about something as you do, so the group never ends up working for the thing you wanted, is not fun. Needless to say, this first look at player housing has honestly left me with more questions than answers. But what about you? Are you excited? Do you share any of my concerns? Have I asked any stupid questions that I wouldn't have asked if I did play Final Fantasy XIV? Do you already know who you want to be in a neighborhood with? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, you can always like, subscribe, comment, share, all that good YouTube stuff. I'd also like to gently highlight my Patreon, where you can support the channel directly. Finally, you can find me on Blue Sky or very occasionally Twitch, where I'm always happy to talk about all things World of Warcraft, and a few other subjects as well. So while that's all for now, hopefully I'll see you again soon.